Hey, what's up guys, Alex here, thank you for checking this video and welcome to the episode number 34 of the series of tutorial on how to build a premium theme for WordPress. Welcome again. In this tutorial we're going to take a look on how to solve a couple of remaining issues of our Ajax infinite scroll pagination. So in the previous lesson we activated a nice transition. It was like pretty much done everything to improve the user experience, the overall interaction of the pieces, but now we have a technical issue that it's actually a real bug. So first, in my page, I'm loading by default the first two posts, so I'm technically on page 1. If I click load more, I load other two posts, so I'm technically on page 2. If I click again, I'm technically on page 3 and so on. So if the user decides, for example, oh, cool, I want to check this video post title, I want to check these actual posts, and I want to click here, goes inside, check the posts. Of course, the style is different, but we're gonna style the single PHP page in the future. But for example, he's reading the post, he's done reading, he wants to go back and check other posts. So if we click the back arrow, the first thing that he's gonna see is the initial page, so the first two posts. And this is not good because we are forcing our user to re-click again and load parts that he already loaded, and he shouldn't do it. So if the user decides to go back with the back arrow of the browser, he should start again on the same page that he visited or the last post he saw before clicking and going inside the single blog post. In order to do that, we have to dynamically with JavaScript updating our URL here to reflect the actual pagination of WordPress. So let's do that. First of all, we have to create a new wrapper around our container, around our posts to specify in which page they belong. So let's access our index.php, that is where our loop starts, and here inside the if have posts, we're going to activate this container only if we have posts. We can echo a new container, a new wrapper for our posts. So let's echo. Let's create a div with a class, a unique class that I have to remember because I'm going to refer it in JavaScript, and I want to call it page limit to specify the limit of each page that contains our post. And here inside this div, I want to specify a data attribute called data page that is going to be equal to the structure of WordPress to specify the page. But because this is the index, so this is the first one, I want to just specify a slash. So every time I update the URL, this slash is going to remove whatever other pagination we have if we scroll back in time, if we scroll back in our blog loop. Let's close this tag, let's close the semicolon, and inside here we have to wrap echo, close the div, and semicolon. Let's save it, let's go back in our front end, let's refresh, and of course, nothing happens pretty much. It's pretty much the same. If we access the inspector and we check inside our primary content area, main, we open, inside the container, we're gonna have the page limit, that is this new wrapper, this new container wrapper that is wrapping around our posts. And of course now we have to do the same for the other posts, because if we load more, of course these other two posts are not gonna be inside any page limit, but are gonna be completely outside. So we have to extend the Ajax function to include this page limit with the new type of page. So in this case, it's gonna be page 2. Let's access again our content editor. Let's access our ajax.php file. That is the file that takes care of the loading of the new post. And we have to do pretty much exactly the same, except we have to change just the data page attribute. So inside the if statement only, if we have posts, let's write echo, and let's do the same, a div with a class called page-limit, And here we have to specify a data attribute called data page that in this case is gonna be different and it's gonna reflect the current page that our posts belong to. And in order to easily select this attribute and use it to update the URL, we wanna use the default pagination structure of WordPress if we have a proper permalink section. So in this case, it's gonna be /page/ and here could be 2, could be 3, could be 4, whatever. We have to do it dynamically, of course, and we already have this value that is actually paged, is the variable that we're using to update the WP query and grab the current post of next pages. So that's perfect. Let's interrupt the echo with single quotes. Let's connect with dot, and let's put the variable paged in here. And here we can close this div, and down here we can echo, semicolon, and let's just simply close the div. This has to be a semicolon, not a colon. Save it. Let's go back in our front end. Let's refresh. Pretty much nothing's gonna change. If we load more, of course, we're gonna have our posts, but we have a small issue. So first of all, let's detect, cool, we have the page 2. This is pretty cool. If we load more, we're gonna have another container with page 3 and so on, so on. Now we have a small issue though, because this article is getting the treatment of the first child. If you remember when we styled the loop the first time, we have a specific padding between articles, but we specify a bigger padding, like a higher padding for the first child to have 80 pixels and have a more padding on top here. We cannot have this anymore because every time we wrap the article inside the page limit for CSS, this is a first child. So also this article is gonna have this gigantic padding top of 80 pixels. We could solve it in 2 ways, or we could specify a last child of this blog post or with a padding bottom 0, but we don't really want that because otherwise this button is going to be completely attached to this one. Or we can simply apply the padding to the actual container and not the single article. So that is the easiest way. Let's do that. First of all, let's check the class here. So we have to reflect this article first child inside our Sass file. Let's go back. Let's access our sunset.scss. Let's search for article class and first child padding top. No, we want to remove this. So let's cut this stuff away. Let's save it. Let's go back here. Let's refresh. Of course, we're not going to have the padding top anymore, but we want to apply the padding top to the sunset posts container that we know is not going to be repeated because the container is just one. So let's do that. Let's scroll back down where we declare in our Ajax loading the sunset post container. And here we can specify the padding top attribute directly inside here without specifying other different things. So padding top is going to be for 80 pixels, or probably is too much. Yes, it's kind of too much because we have 80 pixel plus 40 of the article. So let's just put it down to 40 and we're going to have the actual original 80 pixels. That's perfect. And of course, if we load more, because we are not repeating the container, the padding is still 80 pixel and remains consistent. So we fixed also this kind of weird issue. Now we have all these containers, all these wrappers around our post. If we select this, we open, we don't have anymore the list of the posts, but we have the posts grouped by their own containers with their own page. What we have to do now, we have to do with JavaScript, we have to detect if we are, when we're scrolling in our page, if we are passing this container, and we have to update the URL based on the data page attribute of the container that we are actually viewing. Make sense? Hopefully. Let's do that together. So let's access again our text editor. Let's access our sunset.js and let's organize better a little bit here. So here let's declare variable declarations. And here, let's call this section carousel functions. And I always misspell functions. Perfect. And this one is going to be, it's going to be init function. That means the initialization, the function that initialize everything before the Ajax, or you can put it at the bottom before the helper class. Let's do that at the helper class before the helper class. It's going to be way more organized. We can use this section to declare and detect scroll functions. Inside here, we can use a default jQuery detector to detect the scrolling of our mouse if we go up and down. If we scroll or we slide or whatever is happening, if we're scrolling through our page, this detection is going to be activated. So in order to do that, we have to use a $sign for jQuery. Inside, we have to check the window, and the window is a default global pre-initialized, pre-defined variable that is connected to the actual window of our browser. So if when the window scroll, and this is the function of jQuery, just simple like when scrolls, let's create a custom function inside this scroll functionality. So we're saying to this code that when the window is scrolling, we have to execute whatever is happening inside this custom function that we're declaring. Inside here, we have to detect a bunch of things. First, we have to specify a bunch of variables that we need to use in order to detect properly the position, the location of our container. So first, let's declare a scroll that it's going to be equal to $window, that is of course our window browser, scroll top. And the scroll top is going to be updated every time we scroll. If we check and we go console log and we console log our scroll variable, save it, let's go back in the front end, refresh, and we access the console here. When I'm scrolling, you see this number, it's increasing. So this is the actual pixel value of the distance between the top of my page and the current top position of my window. So my windows is scrolling down and is creating this separation, this distance between the actual top of my website and the top of the browser. So right now I'm 1,000 pixels away from the top of my actual website. And this value is super useful because we can use it to detect the actual location of our scrolling position, and we can detect if we are touching or we are inside another specific element. Let's start with another variable that we have to declare, but we have to declare outside our scroll, because every time we scroll, this variable gets updated dynamically every time. As you notice, the number was increasing every time we were scrolling. We need a variable that is fixed and doesn't change until we want it, so we have to declare it initially inside this section, the variable declaration. So let's declare another variable called last_scroll that by default is going to be 0. We're going to use this variable to store every time we check and we detect a container that we are interested into, and we're going to update the value of this last scroll to be fixed and to not repeat the same check every time. This probably is kind of confusing, but bear with me for a couple of minutes and it's going to be way clear with the execution of this function. So now we have these two variables, scroll and last scroll. Now we have to check if these two variables are at the same location of our window height, of our position. So let's do that by declaring an if statement, the math$absolute abs. This function of JavaScript creates a mathematical operation to whatever value we specify inside our brackets to round up. So we're gonna remove decimal, we're gonna remove all like more than decimal decoration. We're gonna have an integer number. So we're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 100, 2000, no comma, no dots, no weird stuff. So it's gonna be an integer, easier to calculate. We have to create an operation that is gonna be scroll minus last scroll. This operation is gonna be updated every time we scroll. So now at the beginning, we're gonna have -0 minus 0. We scroll, we're gonna have like 100 minus 0 or whatever. So we're gonna detect if the scrolling of our position, the current position of our window, minus the last scroll that initially is 0, so it's gonna be exactly like that, is bigger than the actual window dot height. But I don't want the entire height of the window. This function is gonna detect the entire height of our browser, but I don't want this entire height, but I want just the 10% of my height. To detect the 10% of my height, I have to do just a simple math calculation that is gonna be a multiplication per 0.1. Let's open the curly brackets. Let's go on another line. Okay, just to quickly recap, we are retrieving an absolute integer of this scroll position that, as you saw in the console, is increasing or decreasing based on where you're scrolling. If you're scrolling down, increases, minus the last scroll position that by default is going to be 0. If this value here is bigger than the 10% of the window height, so if we have 1000 pixels of window height, we're gonna check if the scroll is bigger than 100 pixels, because 10% of 1000 pixels is 100. So if this happens, we're gonna first update the last scroll equal to scroll. So we're gonna prevent to keep executing this stuff because we're updating our last scroll at the same position of the scroll. So if this is 100, this is a 0, and it's bigger than 100 pixels. So for example, this gets 110 pixels. The 10% of Windows height 100 is 100 pixels. This declaration is true, but only because the last scroll is 0. If this declaration is true, we're gonna update the last scroll to reflect this scroll. So this last scroll is gonna be 110 as well. So this is gonna start with scrolling 110 minus 110 is not bigger than the 10% of the Windows height. So the function is not gonna get executed multiple times if the declaration gets updated. Hopefully it's clear. I know that could be really confusing, but it's kind of a normal operation. It's kind of a standard operation. We are only detecting few things, and if you have some doubts, try to update these values and check what happens if you change the value. But anyway, now that we have a true declaration, so our scroll position is bigger than the 10% of the window height, we can detect if our page limit $select dot page dash limit, and we're gonna use the jQuery function to loop inside the page limit with each function, and inside the function as a variable we can specify the index, so we're gonna reflect which page limit we are currently viewing, and inside the curly brackets, open it, semicolon. Inside here, we can detect. So now this function is looping through all the page limits that we are. Of course, at the beginning, it's gonna be just one because we're loading just the first one. Every time we load more, we're gonna have more page limits. So every time it scrolls, it's gonna detect more page limits containers. And we have to check only if the page limit is visible. It's actually inside the container. So let's detect if, and to do that, we're gonna use a custom class that we're gonna call isVisible. And inside here, we can declare the $this, that if you remember, I already told you what this $is. Basically, refers to the current page limit, the current container that we're looping inside the each. So it's gonna be the first, the second, the third. Every time we loop this is gonna reflect the actual container. So now we have to create this function is visible, that it's an helper function to detect if our page limit is visible inside our window, because we don't want to use this page limit if it's not inside our view. Let's scroll back down here. Let's create another function called isVisible. And inside here, we have to pass the element, of course, and we're going to call element. Open and close the brackets, because we're passing the current element that we're checking. And here we have to do another kind of weird calculation, but it's not really weird. We have to detect if this element, this current element, is at least 25% visible inside the page. So if this container is inside the page as a sort of like bottom position, and we're looking at the element and it's visible to the actual user. So first we have to declare a bunch of different variables. The first variable is variable scroll pos, that it's equal to the actual scroll position. And we already used this kind of variable in the previous function. So window $scroll top. Second variable is window height, that it's gonna be, of course, equal to the window dot height. Third variable is the element top. So we have to check what's the current position, what's the distance of this element to the top of our page. So dollar, let's check the element inside here. It's gonna be offset top. This offset top detects the offset, the distance between the element. The other variable is the element height. Height. And we have to detect, of course, again, the height of the element. It's pretty straightforward for now. Element dot height. And the last variable that we need is the bottom of the element, so the distance between the element and the bottom of the page. And unfortunately, offset doesn't have a bottom attribute, a bottom value, but we can create this bottom value by ourselves by doing the sum of the top value of this element plus the height of this element. So we're gonna have the distance between the element and the top of the page and the height of this element, and we're gonna have the bottom of the element. So we're gonna have the pixel value of where this element that we're currently checking stops, so it doesn't extend anymore. And now we can return a value that is gonna be 0, is gonna be positive or negative. This function, if we return a negative value, it's equal to false. If we return a positive value, it's equal to true. So we can just simply do a math operation and return whatever result we have, because if it's negative, it's going to be false. So we can use this as a check. The function is slightly complicated, but not too much. So first operation is going to be the bottom value of this element minus the 25% of the element height, so L height, multiplied by 0.25. It's bigger than the scroll position, so when we are, and another declaration, element underscore top is minus, then another brackets, the scroll position plus 0.5 to implement just a half a pixel plus the 50% of the window height. We have to close all these entire operations inside another pair of simple brackets. So this is a function that is gonna return true or false if we have these two declaration checked. So if the first declaration, it means if the element bottom, the bottom element of our current element that we're checking, the page limit container, minus the height of the element, of the 25% of the height of the element is bigger than the position of the scroll, and the top of the element is minor, so it's less than, this is scroll pause, sorry, of the 50% of the window height plus the scroll position, we're gonna return false. So basically this whole operation is to check if the element is inside our current viewport of the user and is not at the bottom or not at the top, so we didn't pass it. Let's save it, and of course before continuing, let's just console log just simple visible, and let's refresh and let's keep the console open just to test. We have one simple element here that is the let's open this container. We have one simple page limit that starts here. This is the 100% of the height of our window, so from here to here. The script is detecting if this element is inside this window for at least 25%. So the 25% of this value is going to be something like here. So if we scroll down, this element, boom, goes inside. So now it's visible and remains visible. If we scroll, it remains visible. So this visible console log doesn't get repeated because we don't have any more elements. If we load more, we're gonna have another element coming, and if we update, boom, we're gonna have another visible. So it means that our function repeated and checked and detected another container, the second one, the second page limit. Now that we have this check, that we know when our page limit, the current one, is currently visible in our viewport, we can update the URL. And we have this amazing option, the amazing functions of default JavaScript and HTML5 to dynamically replace the URL without updating the page. To do that, we can use the built-in variable called history, and we can use the function replace state. So history replace state is a default JavaScript and HTML5 declaration to push a new state inside the URL. And this whole function is part of the web API. It's a great thing, and luckily are pretty much supported by everything. If you're worried about the support of Internet Explorer, you can use Modernizer to extend this functionality, but it's something that we're gonna see in the future. So the push state has three options, has three attributes that we can declare. First of all, we can pass custom variables. If we want, we can create an array with custom variable, custom attributes, and pass it dynamically. We don't need that, so our first value is null. The second is the title of the page. We can dynamically update the title of the page. So if we want, we could declare like page 2, but we don't want that. We want to keep it dynamic as possible and not affect the title of the page. So also the second parameter is null. The third parameter is the actual URL. What do we want to push inside our URL bar? And if we have a full URL, it's going to replace everything completely. If we have a portion of the URL, it's going to append this URL to the current address that we are visiting. And our URL is inside the page limit, inside our data attribute. So we have to access it by simply using $this.attribute, open and close the brackets, and data page. And then we can return false to interrupt the execution of our script if we have the visible status. So let's not execute this replace state multiple times every time we scroll, but only if it happens the first time. Let's save it. Let's go back here. Let's go scroll up. Let's refresh. Scroll down. Nothing happens because we are on the first page. Let's load more. Scroll down. Did you see here? Page 2. Let's scroll down again. Load more. Boom, page 3. If we scroll back up, page 2, and if we scroll back up, page 0. So now, if we are on page 3, we load the video post title, go back here, we go back, WordPress is gonna load page 3 by default, and we're gonna start from actually the posts of page 3 because we're loading the content of page 3. Now we have a little bit of problem because if we load page 3 like I was before, now you see I don't have any more page 3, because even if this is actually page 3, my container here, the page limit, doesn't have the current page. And if I click load more, it's gonna load the second and the third post. See, it's page 2. For him, it's page 2, but these posts belong to page 3. In fact, if I load one more time, I'm gonna load the same exact posts that I have at the beginning. This is an issue that we can easily fix with our code. So first of all, let's go back here. Let's refresh to start again, same location, the same situation as before. We have to update a bit both the index.php and these data page attribute dynamically with the same custom function that we're gonna create. So first, let's create a function here to replace this empty status, because by default it's gonna be empty, but we don't know yet, because if we access the index page on page 3, this cannot be empty. This should have -page -3. So let's create a function called simply dot, and I'm gonna print the function directly here. So sunset underscore check underscore paged to check the current page. And here, let's do the same for this page 1. And let's use the same function, but I want a different output of the function. So I'm gonna dynamically change the output of the function with a custom attribute. And let's echo sunset underscore check underscore paged. And here I'm gonna pass the variable 1 because you're gonna see it later. We're gonna use it right now. So let's copy this function here. Let's access our ajax.php. Let's keep everything here because this paged function is relative to the Ajax function. So let's keep everything in one place, easier to update. Let's scroll down here after the closing brackets of the sunset load more. Let's call, let me create a little bit of space. Let's call function sunset check page, open and close the bracket. We declare a variable before, we declare attribute to pass to this function, but we didn't use it here. So we have to declare a default attribute that has to be null because we won't accept the fact that no attribute has been passed. So $num, I want to call this like number, it's by default equal to null. Even if we don't pass anything, it's not going to trigger any error. Let's create our usual output variable that it's empty. And we start by detecting if we have a page. So if we can use a default is paged function of WordPress that will return true or false, it's just a boolean, if we are inside a sort of pagination. So if we are not on page 0, this is going to be true. And if this is true, we can update our $output variable to reflect the current page that we're actually viewing. So this output is going to be equal to page dash, let's connect with a dot, and let's use a global variable query initialized by WordPress by default with the get query underscore var, and it's going to be equal to paged. So if you remember the previous lesson, we set a query var and we get the query var for our classes, for our dynamic class. This get query var paged is a global variable that is not really a global variable, but is a variable that we can access with this function anywhere that reflects the current status of our pagination. And this works if we are inside the loop. And because we are actually inside the loop, we are inside the index.php, this variable works like a charm, so we're not gonna have any problem. Now I have to return, I could simply return the output, but I want this output to be empty here if we are on page 0, or to be dash page dash 1, 2, 3, whatever, if we're more than one. But here I want just the number. So that's why I'm passing this value here. So I can check in my function that if the $num, that is the variable that I declare here in the function, is identical to 1, it's equal to 1, we can return something, otherwise we can return something else. So if this is not equal to 1, so it's null, we can just simply return the output. That means that if we have a page, this is gonna be page dash number of the page, otherwise it's gonna be empty. So if it's page 0, it's gonna return empty and our initial container is gonna work. If the number is equal 1, it means that we just want the variable, the actual number of the page, and we can return that variable. We cannot return simply the query var page because the query var page starts at 0 by default. We want it to start at 1, so we have to just check if the page is 0. So let's do this by writing a custom variable called paged, that it's equal to open brackets, an inline if statement that get, let's copy this one, I don't want to rewrite it again, get query var, if this it's equal identical to 0, question mark, the first result has to be 1, otherwise I can return this. So this page variable is going to be equal to 1 if this page is 0, otherwise if paged is not 0, is going to be equal to page, because this page variable starts at 0 and then jumps directly to 2. So we start at page 0 for WordPress, starts at 0, and then we go 2, 3, 4. So we are skipping page 1, but my number in this data page button has to be 1 if we are on the first page. That's why I'm doing this. And here I can return the $paged variable. Save it. Let's go back in our front end. Let's refresh. Let's check our source code inside the inspector. First, let's check our container here. That is the page limit. Data page is equal to nothing, so it's 0 first page. And if we scroll down, we check our load more button. The data page is 1, so the function is working. We load. Data page is not dynamically updated, of course, in the console, but our page 2 gets activated with the URL. And if we click load more, it should load the post of page 3. That's perfect. Page 3 updated in the URL. Now we access the video post title. We click go back. We are on page 3. If we scroll, nothing gets updated. We're still on page 3 because if we detect the container here, we're gonna have data page 3 by default. And if we access the button here and we check inspect the element, we're gonna see that the data page where we are, it's actually 3. So if we click load more, it's gonna load page 4. Audio post title updated to page 4. Image post title. That's great. If we scroll back up, we are on page 3. That's great. We dynamically generated these options to remember the location of our user, where is currently, what page is currently viewing, and we are dynamically with JavaScript and HTML5 and the web API updating the URL of our pagination without refreshing the page. And this is amazing. Well, it's pretty much it for today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel. And if you want, please spend a couple of minutes to check the support me page on my website, where you can find different ways and methods to support me, support my channel, and help me to do better videos and better tutorials for you. Thank you again, guys, for checking these videos. And until the next lesson, as usual, happy coding.